are talking about the 8-part mini-series Black Summer. Now this is actually a spin-off of the Asylum-produced Z Nation TV show, and Asylum actually produced this series. Now before you switch this review off and think, surely you don't mean that Asylum, and yes I do, they've actually done an admirable job of this one. So Black Summer, it's basically a zombie series, 8 episodes, and like I say, it's a spin-off of the Z Nation TV show. Now, I didn't like Z Nation. I gave it a try. You know, I enjoy walking, I still watch it to this day. And I gave Z Nation a try, but I just found it stupid. The characters were all OTT. It ended up being just a little bit too campy, a little bit too kind of like sci-fi and kind of a bit cheap as well. This one, I have to say, is significantly different to Z Nation, although apparently it takes place in the same universe. I do believe this is kind of set sometime before. And the basic story, it follows groups of survivors, kind of like a month or two after a zombie apocalypse. Now the zombies in this series are like the Dawn of the Dead and remake, the Zack Snyder one. They're very much like that. These are not your Walking Dead style zombies. These can kind of run, and they are almost instantly turned. They're very much like the kind of the Rage infected in the kind of 28 Days Later series, although these ones are dead. They are zombies. So it focuses on various different kind of groups of characters. As the kind of series progresses through its 8 episodes, it ultimately shifts focus to members of the group. Now this group is not tightly knit like the kind of the group in Walking Dead. It's a very kind of loose affiliation, and there's a lot of distrust here. And the name of the game with this show is absolute chaos, because there's no sense of structure. The kind of this group is very kind of tenuous at best, and kind of allegiances shift, and there's lots of kind of infighting, and kind of there's a lot of death in this series. And it focuses this kind of group of survivors whose numbers kind of change, and kind of members kind of change as the kind of the series kind of goes on, and they ultimately are trying to find this apparent safe haven, which is at this stadium in the kind of the centre of the city, and it chronicles their events to try and get there. So that's your kind of your basic setup. So what works for me? So that I actually thought this was a very, very well produced series. Now, like I've said, this is produced by the Asylum, and they have done a lot of cheap mockbusters, a few clunkers, but I will say they can do a decent movie if they try, because the Asylum has actually produced a few decent horror movies, but they kind of just forgotten in amongst the shuffle, along with the kind of all the tidal wave of kind of mockbusters and kind of knockoffs. There is actually a number of actually pretty good of horror movies here. Now the main man behind this series is John Hyams, I think his name is. He's kind of like the director who directs the most episodes. He's written a number of episodes. He actually has done a number of the Z Nation episodes as well. I guess outside of that, he's most notably known for doing a couple of the Universal Soldier sort of later movies, the kind of sequels from that sort of series with Van Damme. But I've got to say, he does a really admirable job here, and this series has a very kind of like almost a kind of handheld kinetic experience. It's not a found footage series, but at times it kind of feels like it's that type of aesthetic, the way that you have a kind of shaky cam, the way it's kind of following these people kind of running around. But I have to say that aesthetic really works for this, because it just the kind of setup of this show is pure chaos. It's just pure chaos. People are just running around, and not sure who's alive, who's dead, because these zombies are not your slow walkers, and they're relatively, some of them are relatively fresh. So it's hard to sometimes differentiate who's alive and who's dead, and there are mistakes that are made within this kind of series. So it's just the kind of the pure chaos, and the kind of the last episode, it really emphasises that with just, the whole episode being a complete action set piece, which is utter chaos. The last episode's actually significantly shorter, I should point out as well. I gotta say, I thought the acting here was all top notch. I thought there's no clunkers here. All the acting is good across the board. You know, everyone does a great job, and they all have this sense of panic. They all have clearly kind of like defined personalities. I don't think the characters are particularly well realised to a certain degree, and we'll come on to that. But they, you know, you'll kind of get to know them to a point at least throughout the kind of the series. I loved the music. The music of this series was incredible, and really kind of like it's a memorable score that is truly kind of haunting in the kind of in the scary aesthetic, and just action packed. It's very kind of like when you have actors here, which does a great job of kind of emphasising those scenes. But the location shooting here was all great. I mean, for a show which is, I mean, obviously what's happening here. This is obviously a Netflix show, and they've kind of upped the budget considerably to your typical kind of, you know, asylum movies, and also the Z Nation TV series, which was I believe a sci-fi one. But you know, Netflix have ploughed a bit more money into this, and you can see it on screen because we have all sorts of different kind of locales here, from, you know, kind of more rural settings to kind of cityscapes to kind of like schools, all sorts of different things. So you'll see lots of different kind of types of settings throughout the kind of the series. You know, only 8 episodes, but every episode kind of looks different, has kind of a different aesthetic. And that was all pretty good, and so it kind of makes it interesting to look at. You're not always looking at the kind of the same thing. The action here is all top rate, and there are some really, like I said, the gunfights here are very well realised. And the interesting thing with these zombies is they are not an easy, you know, a lot of people are like, you know, you're doing these easy kind of headshots and stuff, but a lot of these people aren't kind of like trained soldiers and stuff, so the headshots aren't as easy. So these zombies sometimes take a long time to kind of go down. It very much reminds me of a video game in certain aspects, because the focus here is more on action and chaos rather than through drama and character development. So that might be a tasting, and I will come on to what I do think it's lacking a little bit in that. But the focus is definitely more action, more kind of ballistic, more kind of like energetic than the kind of a Walking Dead. I remember seeing some of the promo details about this, and it goes, none of the melodrama of the Walking Dead, this is all about the action, and it's true. Now, onto the negatives, I do think that there is a degree of, you don't really kind of know a lot about some of the characters, because it is so kind of focused on this kind of the action aesthetic, and I understand that was a conscious choice, and I actually appreciate it. I do think it works, but nonetheless, I think you do something. At the end, you're kind of starting to kind of know a bit more of the characters. But for example, there's one called Lance who really doesn't say anything through the whole series, to be honest with you. And I really didn't. I thought he's basically going to be a red shirt, so to speak. You know, there are just a little bit. The kind of the female and male lead, you get a little bit more character development on. But that, you know, I just think maybe it could have done a little bit more with kind of a little bit more character work. I know this show deliberately wants to kind of separate itself from The Walking Dead by having it more action based, and it is good because of that. But I still feel it could have done just a tad more character talking and kind of development, just a tad. Despite the fact this obviously has a clearly higher budget than things like the Z Nation and the Asylum films, there are still a couple of wonky sort of digital effects here, particularly in driving sequences where there's a crash. There's a couple of like poorly composited shots, basically, where it looks a little bit wonky in regards to some of the VFX. But the practical stuff all looks fantastic, I have to say, and they haven't gone too OTT with the kind of the zombie makeup, and that's part of the excitement, because you don't really know until kind of maybe sometimes too late who's a zombie and who isn't. And I also, going back to the positives, I also think that, you know, part of the fun is with this show is it introduces you to these characters and then bam, they are dead. You know, Walking Dead does that, Game of Thrones does that. I appreciate that, because this is kind of like only 8 episodes, and it's like you're never really sure who's going to kind of be a main character and who isn't. And some of the moral choices that have to be inflicted on these kind of characters at a very kind of a short time. They're not long drawn out. They have to make a quick decision, and they take it or they don't. So that was all pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth a watch. I don't really have much negative things to say about this, to be honest with you. I actually think this is a pretty stellar show. Like I've said, if you want more character development, it may be a little bit too kind of balls to the wall for some people. I do think, actually, the only other thing I would say, I do think although this is definitely a different tone to Z Nation, there were once or twice where I felt it just started to steer towards a bit more of the silly moments. I think it's episode 5 or 6 where they kind of go into this like an underground club thing, and to me that was a little bit, it was veering towards a little bit kind of silly, that one particular episode. That was the only episode where I felt it kind of maybe just didn't, it just kind of veered away into a bit more of a campy kind of aesthetic. But the rest of the other 7 episodes I thought were all very good. But I would thoroughly recommend this one. Really good kind of zombie alternative to Walking Dead. And like I've said, if you enjoy the Dawn of the Dead remake, if you enjoy 28 Days Later, this is definitely a one to watch. Now, I still don't think it will make me watch Z Nation, because I just couldn't get into that. The characters were too typically TV, but here they are gritty, more realistic, and I would like them to keep that tone if we do have a season 2. I'm not sure if it will have that. The ending's maybe a little bit kind of ambiguous about if we will or not, but I would definitely watch it again. So give this one an 8 out of 10. Actually, properly thoroughly recommended this one. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.